Welcome to the Hollis Chapman Show, where we celebrate the power of words and the beauty of storytelling. Join us on this journey as we delve into the minds of successful authors and small business owners who have mastered the art of crafting captivating narratives that inspire, educate, and entertain. Prepare to be inspired as we explore the boundless possibilities that come from sharing stories and experiences that shape our lives and ignite our passions. Through heartfelt conversations and insightful discussions, we uncover the wisdom and creativity that fuel these incredible individuals in their pursuit of greatness. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let the magic of storytelling transport you to new worlds and perspectives. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and uplifted as we embark on this storytelling journey together. Stay tuned for an episode filled with wisdom, inspiration, and the power of words. Welcome to the Hollis Chapman Show. Say where stories come alive. Let's begin this adventure together. Don't miss out on the opportunity to connect with some of the most talented and compelling voices in literature today. Tune in and let the journey begin.
Hey, welcome to the Hollis Chapman Show, everybody. Happy Tuesday. First, before we get started, we really want to give a big shout out to our special guest who stepped in like 15 minutes ago to do this show. So thank you so much for our special guest. Okay, before we bring him on, our guest was born in Canada, a nation of humble, polite individuals who secretly think who invited space travel and the English language. Let's welcome to our show our special guest, Sebastian de Castile. Hello, sir.
Hi, Hollis. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate that. Things happen, but it's so good to have a person like yourself who's willing to do this for
My
us
pleasure.
today. You know, great content. We always want that, so we knew you'd be a great fit. So tell us more about yourself and tell us about your third book that you have out there.
Well, third book in this series. So for those of your listeners that don't know me, so I'm Sebastian de Castel. I'm a Canadian fantasy novelist. I'm probably best known for the Greatcoats series that started with Trader's Blade, which was a four-book swashbuckling fantasy series, a little bit like, the Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones. So if that's something that appeals to you, it's a quite a popular series and my still probably in some ways my favorite books. And then Spellslinger, which is a YA magical fantasy series that's been translated into, I don't know, 14 languages now and optioned for film and TV and sort of done its way around the world. And most recently, my most recent novel, which Hollis, you and I talked about briefly last time I was on, which was Our Lady of Blades, which was by far the most complex and intricate book I'd ever written. And then my upcoming novel is called Malevolent Nine. It is the end of the trilogy that started with Malevolent Seven, which, in contrast to Our Lady of Blades, which took me 7 years to write, Malevolent Seven was a book that I accidentally wrote in a month and then went on to become one of my bigger sort of hit books.
You know, Sebastian, what motivates you to do what you do in writing? As I said, you write stuff, but writing and being an author, being successful is very lonely. You're back there by yourself, and the family's got to sit and wait, stuff like that. What keeps you motivated to write and continue to do it? Otherwise, I know you're doing very well, but for people who are starting out, I said again, this can be very lonely. What keeps you motivated?
Well, it's funny. It's such a good sort of starting point because I think that it is something that people really feel like is going to be an issue as a writer, which is, as you say, that sense of loneliness, sort of isolation. But in my experience has been completely different, and I think it really doesn't have to be that way. And if there's one thing I've done, I think quite well as just a human being in this profession, it's been kind of organizing my life, my relationships in this business in such a way that I really never feel lonely. And so I don't experience that solitude that, I'm in this all by myself. And in fact, one example of that is this conversation, right? Like, in fact, I get to take a break from my writing and come spend some time with you, and through you spend a little bit of time with your audience, and so that is, makes you feel connected, right? But on top of that, I have other quite successful novelist friends out here. For some reason, Vancouver just has a ton of them, and we get together for brunch. Every month or so, 4 or 5 of us, just to kind of hang out and connect and complain about whatever's going on in the industry or talk about whatever we're writing. And so that becomes a sense of support. But even beyond that, I've been really blessed with, my editors, starting from the inimitable Joe Fletcher, who's kind of a legend in the fantasy business, who will talk to me about a story. Like I don't have to send her in fact, I almost never send her a finished manuscript. I'll send her like, an act of a novel at a time and go, listen, here's what I'm worried about. What do you think about this? And we'll talk about it. And because, as you can tell, I'm a very verbal person. So I, in a sense, I think by talking. So for me, isolation would be really, really counterproductive a lot of the time as a novelist. So the good news for your listeners out there who are writers themselves or want to be writers themselves is you don't have to be a writer who lives an isolated existence. You can find ways to kind of connect your writing life with with a social life in a sense. So a lot of the friends I hang out with, when I go play, this weekend I'm going to go play Dungeons and Dragons of all things. I'm one of the worst Dungeons and Dragons players in the world, which is great because I'm in a terrible Dungeons and Dragons group that's made up entirely of novelists.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that, and the listeners and people watching. In this age of computers and everybody sitting behind computers, you do a wonderful thing because you get out from behind the computer, go and associate with your friends, go and associate with, and that gets you out there. Because that's what I'm trying to do more myself is go to meetup groups, go to different groups and stuff like that, and say, oh, I'm Hollis from the Hollis Chapman Show. I'm this and this and this, and they can see there's a real live person out there. And that's so important what you do, and it's so important this day and age. So what you're doing is very helpful. You really get the word out and say, yes, Sebastian is a real life person. He's got this, he does this, and that's a great way to do it in this day and age of sitting behind the computer, right?
My friend, you've made what I think is just such an important point about just our life in this particular period of time. When people say, I'm hanging out with my friends online, which is okay. Sometimes you have to do that, right? We had COVID. There were times where you had to do these things. But when someone says, oh, all my friends are online, or only hang out with my friends online, to me, it's sort of like asking someone, hey, do you spend a lot of time in nature? And they go, oh yeah, all the time. I have my screensaver is a redwood forest, right? You would never think that was the same thing as being out in the forest. So for me, I've never felt like just being online or connecting to people through, social media or forums or things like that, that never feels like it fulfills that crucial sort of sense of being in the presence of another person. I mean, we know this because we talk differently when we're in front of someone. We might, have very different political views from someone, but in person, we're always going to be a little bit more measured in what we say. We're always going to listen a little more, whereas online, that doesn't happen. And so, yeah, for me, my wife will sometimes say this. She says, you go out for lunch with people like more often than anybody I know, which is weird for a novelist who's, theoretically supposed to be trapped behind their screen all the time. And it's true I can't get the same sense of connection, not just to people, but to reality. I can't get that from just through a screen. I get it from just as with nature. I get it from being out in nature. I get it from being with people.
Perfect. Okay, your book, characters grapple with the repercussions of the Great Crusade. Did you think the aftermath of such a conflict alters a person's sense of identity? Did you read his book?
It really does. So for those of your listeners who don't know, The Malevolent Seven is a fantasy novel. It's an irreverent, dark fantasy novel. It's a bit like if you think of The Magnificent Seven, but with wizards going around blowing things up and swearing constantly. I think my agent used to refer to it as Deadpool in Westeros. And so these characters are very much sort of anti-heroes, and in the first book of the series, they see themselves as, look, we are not good guys. We're mercenary war mages. We've done terrible things. It's a terrible world. That's just the way it is, you know. But then they're forced into this position where there are no heroes to solve this particular danger to humanity, and so they're sort of accidentally forced to do the right thing. And in the second book, Malevolent 8, they start sort of in the clumsy way that people do, deciding, well, I guess if we're heroes, let's act like heroes. Like literally down to the point where one of the characters is like, well, we should have really cool looking uniforms, you know, that all match so people, you know that we're heroes. And that book culminates in this sort of massive conflict that they managed to prevent from happening, a war between two supernatural forces that would engulf the mortal realm. And they managed to sort of prevent that from happening, but in true Malevolent 7 fashion, it accidentally results in a bunch of these fairly nasty supernatural beings becoming the new gods of the mortal realm. And so, and in Malevolent 9, Cade, who is our narrator, he's the main character of this series, is absolutely determined to kill these gods, because he's like, you know, the last thing the mortal realm needs is a bunch of gods, you know, deciding how people live. But the problem that he encounters is that in some ways these new gods, even though he doesn't trust them, he's convinced there's a nasty plan behind it all, seem like they're trying to bring paradise to humanity, which forces him and the rest of the Malevolent Seven to ask this question: well, if we're fighting people that are ostensibly trying to bring about paradise, even if it's not the paradise we envision, you know, what does that make us? Like, are we basically the devil in this scenario? And Cade especially has to contend with that. So it was magnificently fun to write that aspect of it, of a character who is fighting gods and slowly having to wonder if he is basically turning into the devil in this world.
I hear you speak. You have some great vision, your vision, your ability to create things is unbelievable. Who do you look to? Is there a certain TV series you go to? What does Sebastian do to get your ideas? Because you have plenty of ideas and you do it very well. What do you do to keep your ideas going? What does Sebastian do to keep the ideas flowing?
You know, it's a really good question, because people always, you know, you're a writer yourself, you know, people will always ask you, where do you get your ideas from? And we all have our different ways of answering that question. But one of the ways we often answer it is, look, ideas are never the problem, right? Every novelist I know has a million ideas that they're never going to write. In fact, a good friend of mine is a novelist who's written a lot of, you know, Star Wars novels and things like that. And he's sort of reached an age where he sort of said, you know, now I have to be very careful what projects I take on, because I can feel that there's a finite number of books I'm going to write before I retire, before I decide I'm not going to write novels for a living anymore. And so, you know, I have to write those ones. So we never struggle with a lack of ideas. But I get writer's block is my default position. That's, you know, I start from writer's block. But in terms of where I go for inspiration, it will be of a particular type. So most often for me, I'm seeking out emotional drama, right? Like when I'm writing a book, even if it's full of swords and magic and, you know, monsters, whatever else, the part that matters to me is the emotional drama that you can get to with those swords and that magic and those monsters. And so I will look in unusual places. For example, you know, I'll sometimes rewatch The West Wing by Aaron Sorkin, right? You know, those first 4 seasons was written by Aaron Sorkin, you know, one of the best dialogue writers out there. He's famous for writing, you know, his scripts are very, very long. The characters have to talk very fast, because he puts because it's a, you know, fixed length of time for a TV episode, but his characters have twice as much dialogue. But the dialogue is beautiful. It's magnificent. I will often seek out that, you know, just great dialogue and prose. Not because I feel like I need to borrow someone's prose, or because prose is not something I really struggle with, but because something about just reading beautiful prose makes me want to sit and write myself. You know what I mean? So I look in weird places. And I'm really lucky that I have so many friends who are novelists where I can go and read or reread something they were writing because I can kind of attach it to my knowledge of them and go, oh, that's how the way that they talk when they're talking about writing translates into what they actually write. And it kind of helps me think about my own way of thinking about writing and therefore what's going to be appear on the page.
Sebastian, you mentioned about having some stuff on TV. We're always talking about getting people on TV as well. What they come to you, or you went to them, whoever they are, to start getting your stuff on TV? Because I think your stuff's going to be outstanding on TV as a series, stuff like that. Who approached? How did that get started? The TV
Sure.
deal.
Well, first I should tamp down any excitement by saying that even when your works are optioned for film and TV, there are multiple stages it has to go through. So the likelihood is always somewhere around between 0 and 1% until the air date, which is that's the nature of that business, right? It's very high budget. It's a high budget world, so it's high consequence. So people cancel things all the time. But in terms of how that works, so certainly in my case, I've had two series that have been optioned for film and TV. So the Greatcoats and Spellslinger. And the way that worked is producers found those books in very strange. Sometimes you hear the stories when they tell you, and you're like, the odds of this happening were ridiculous. So, for example, I remember talking to one TV producer who said, we didn't ultimately sell him the option, but he's a really nice guy and he's worked on some amazing shows. And he said, yeah, I think it was my kid was getting therapy or was in a dentist's office, and I think it was therapy, and his therapist knew that I was a TV producer, and he just handed me your book and said, you should read this. This needs to be a TV series. And then he read it, and then he fell in love with it, right? And that's happened with almost everyone. Like every producer that I've spoken to will have their own story of how they found it. So serendipity is a big force in this part of the world. What happens next is depending on whether you've sold those rights already to your publisher or not, which was the case. So what a lot of new writers don't know is when you write a novel, you write this manuscript, you think of it as I've written a book, right? And we know that a book can come out as a physical print book, like a hardback or a paperback, or it can come out as an ebook, or it can come out as an audiobook. But that's only the first tiny slice, right? Because, for example, a great deal of my income comes from foreign translations. So a French publisher decides to publish a series and it becomes well known in France, and then all of a sudden that's part of your revenue, right? But it also can come from film and television. It can also come from video games or comics. So once you write a story, once you write a book, you have created this, for want of a better term, intellectual property, IP, that can go in multiple places. And when your agent, your literary agent, if you have one, sells your book, what they're doing is they're selling a package of licenses to a publisher. So some publishers, especially the small press, will say, look, we just want the print, ebook, and audio rights in English, for North America, which means, so I have a book coming out with a co-writer, a friend of mine, coming out next year from Simon & Schuster in the United States. It's a science fiction novel. I've never written a science fiction novel before. Thankfully, she understands science, and because I'm terrible at it. But we only sold them the North American English rights, and then we just made a deal for the UK English rights. So you can have multiple deals. Sometimes what you have is what's called a world rights and multiple format deal, which both my first series were. Which is a publisher says, look, we're going to give you this much money, and we get everything. Like we get your film rights, your game rights, your foreign language rights, your radio drama rights, your merchandise rights, your theme park rights, like everything that could come from a property. And then if we sell those rights to somebody else, you get a percentage, 50%, sometimes 80%, whatever it is. So in the case of the film and TV option with both Greatcoats and Spellslinger, They came, in a couple cases, they came to me first, and I had to say, you got to talk to my publishers. And then my publishers say to me, hey, we've got this opportunity. And then there's a lot of negotiation. I think it took 3 years to negotiate the film option for Greatcoats. But then once that's done, and you basically, what you get as a writer out of that is you get some money, and it ranges from next to nothing to insane amounts of money. In my case, it was neither insane amounts of money nor was trivia, nor was it nothing, but not as much as I make just for publishing a book, for when I sell a book itself, for print or audio or things like that. So then they have to go off and they have an exclusive right for the term of the option to try to get the money to develop the project, right? So that's not filming it. That's to get a studio to say, we will give you enough money to pay for a pilot script, to pay for all of these expenses in acquisition. Once that happens, if that happens, then it has to go through that whole development cycle. They write the script, and then they do what's called packaging, right? So they find a big name director, big name actors, things like that. And then they have to get the full budget. And at that point, they buy the property from you, or they say buy it. It's not really buy it. But then they give you a bunch more money so that they now have the rights to actually make it. And then when they're making it as an author, you get a percentage of the production budget, which is usually something like between 2.5 and 4%, but it has what's called a floor and a ceiling. So the floor will be, no matter how small the budget is, they can't pay you less than, let's say, $150,000 US. No matter how big the budget is, they won't pay you more than, let's say, $400,000 US. So there's all these steps. So of every fantasy novel that comes out on the shelves, maybe 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 of those will be optioned for film and TV. Of every one that's optioned, maybe 1 in 50 of those will go to development. Of every one that goes into development, maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 will go to production. And of everyone that goes into production, maybe 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 will actually have an air date. And it just goes down the line until you hit the point where, of all of those, the ones that are the chances that your book will come out on TV or in a movie and be good, like make you happy as an author, those odds are astronomical.
Beautiful. Hey, thanks for sharing that behind the scenes stuff. But I want to bring you back because maybe your agent says, hey, Sebastian, I think we got a TV deal, stuff like that. What was your feeling, without getting to the money and particulars of that, what was your feeling when you went home and said, honey, it's going to happen. We're gonna get something on TV. You're so excited, you forgot to sit there and say, oh, well, how much money am I going to get? Stuff like that. So how did Sebastian handle they're going to make this into a TV when it came to, the money a little bit and this particular thing like that? But because you really kind of, for me, right, that moment, how you broke it down from the high, how did Sebastian handle that? Because very exciting, but then reality hits saying, we're still 10 steps away. How did you handle that?
Well, so I have the great good fortune that I became a novelist by choice. And what I mean by that is, sometimes people say, I'll be asked, do you want to write a screenplay for a film or something, or a TV show? And I almost always just say no. And they'll be like, why not? And I'll say, because before I embarked on this career, I looked around, and here's the thing about Hollywood screenwriters. When I make a book, when I write a novel, that novel, the total risk that a publisher is taking on it, including my advance and how much it costs them to put it out in the world, might be like, I don't know, maybe $100,000, let's say, right? In a typical deal for me. Often people's deals are much, much lower than that, right? Like they're only getting an advance of $5,000 or $10,000 or something, and the production costs are also low. But let's say it's $100,000. No Hollywood screenwriter in the world has ever writes a script, or almost none, where the budget that it takes to bring it to life is going to be $100,000. Right? We're talking millions of dollars, or tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of dollars. So what they make is incredibly consequential financially, and they get paid a lot better. You know, like you can, I think if you write like a, I don't know, a Hallmark Christmas movie, you probably get close to $50,000. And most novelists I know could write one of those in a week. Maybe not, maybe it wouldn't be as good as the ones written by those screenwriters, but you know, from the standpoint of how long it takes you to write a novel, it's completely different. So Hollywood screenwriters work at this much larger scale, right? So how come they're so goddamn miserable? Right? How come they're like the least happy people you'll ever meet at a party? Novelists are happy. For the most part, we're happy, right? Because we get to write something that is our art. And even though like 50 people at some point end up working on that book, it still comes out with our name on that thing. And it's a physical object. And once you've signed a book deal or once you decide to self-publish, the odds of it appearing on the shelf are actually very, very high. It's very unlikely that, you know, it does happen, but it's unlikely that it will produce nothing. Doesn't mean it's going to sell well, but so we have this incredible privilege, right? Artistic privilege. We get to make our art, it's attributed to us, and it usually happens on the shelf. So because I taught for 10 years at an entertainment school called Vancouver Film School, which is a really wonderful place, just amazing students and just, you know, such great teachers and stuff like that. But I knew a lot about that. So when I became a novelist, it wasn't as a stepping stone to being a screenwriter or to have my work on the screen. It was because novelist is to me the greatest job in the world, right? So here's what happens to answer your question directly. My agent comes to me and says, "Hey, it looks like we might have an option for film and TV." And I instantly just go into business mode. I go, okay, great. Let's talk about what rights they want. Let's talk about how much the option's going to be, the terms. And because and the excitement for me doesn't come from, oh, now we've got this option. It comes from talking to the people because they're artists too. So I'll give you an example. So for a while, Chad Stahelski was attached to Greatcoats and to Spellslinger. So he's the director of John Wick. And for people who don't know, John Wick is, from a Hollywood standpoint, kind of a miracle, right? Because they made it on a relatively low budget. They were fought every step of the way, and it became a hit. And then they wanted a sequel, and they didn't want to give them nearly as much as you would, given how hugely successful the first one was. And that became an even bigger hit. And every step of the way. So Chad's a guy who has a track record that's amazing and a life story that's amazing, right? Grew up in Japan, you know, he's a stunt guy, you know, he's a martial artist. We're both fencers at different points in our lives. And so the time I got to talk to him, just for a couple of hours, you know, the first thing he said to me on a Zoom call, I think it was back in 2021 or something. He gets on this call and he's in the middle of, I think he was editing like John Wick 4. And he said, okay, so the first thing you need to know is, since January of this year, so we were talking in April, since January of this year, I've read every single thing you've ever written twice. And I was like, well, that's a lot of books, man. And he's like, he had read everything and he had understood it at a level that very few people do. And so we were talking about aspects of what, you know, kind of drove us about honor and about finding a path in life and fiction representing that. That's the real pleasure, right? That's the fun stuff. I once told the producers who optioned the Greatcoats that the only thing I really cared about was that if there was a premiere, that they would fly my wife and me out and you know, so we'd go on the red carpet and just make sure that my wife was treated like royalty, because then when I saw her smile, I'd feel like, okay, that was a good piece of work, right? And that is my advice to your listeners. The key of what we do is we create art in the form of our stories, right? And our only job is to do that as well as we can. And all of the joy that we will ever have and the success is always sparking off of that singular focus, writing the best book we can, right? And so why does it make me happy talking to Chad Stahelski about you know, details of the Argosy in my books? Because I feel proud of what I wrote, right? If I'd written something crappy or something I didn't care about or just gotten it by luck, it wouldn't feel the same. So you have to approach the core of what you do is make the best book you can, bring it to readers, build an audience of people who love you for your writing, and every other piece of it can be wonderful, but it is a side hustle joy to the core of what we do.
Sebastian, tell us where we go after this show, learn more about you, and make sure you tell us about your wonderful, wonderful website. What do we got?
Thanks so much. So I'm easy to find. My website is decastel.com, so DECASTELL.com. My books are in all the usual places. If you're in the U.S., the Barnes and Noble or Amazon, and Powell's, all the most of the independent bookstores. In the UK, Waterstones and Coles and all those places, and in Canada, of course, our own lovely Indigo here. And so they're easy to find. All my books are in print, ebook, audiobook. If you like to read in French, lots of them are in French or Czech or Hebrew. One of the strangest things in my career, Hollis, was that a couple of years ago, a Ukrainian publisher bought the rights to publish my Spellslinger books in Ukrainian. And I was like, holy crap, they're in the middle of a war. And because they had said, could you write a letter to go in the opening of the book for our Ukrainian teenagers like who might be reading the series, because it's a YA series, and because their lives are a little bit chaotic right now. But I was so amazed that in the middle of, imagine that, in the middle of a war, they're still publishing books. They're still going, hey, this Canadian guy, I like his series, let's translate this. But in terms of finding me, my website's the best way. There's a contact form there. I answer every email. And, I used to joke that the only emails I don't answer are the ones from people claiming to be Nigerian princes with $1 million to give. Now the ones I don't answer are the ones where it's clearly somebody uses AI to summarize one of my books and tell me how great it is and say that they have a marketing service. So I apologize if anyone's genuine about that. You're going to have to find a way to write that email that seems like it was written by a human. Yeah. But I answer all the other emails, and my latest book, if somebody's trying to figure out where to start with my books, Trader's Blade, if you like swashbuckling adventure, Spellslinger if you like YA fantasy, Malevolent 7 if you like lots and lots of swearing, and my latest novel, Our Lady of Blades, is a bit more sophisticated in some ways in terms of the complexity and intricacies, but that's a book I'm tremendously proud of.
Well, I have two more questions. The narrative invites readers to ponder the nature of power and its consequence, okay? What physiological questions do you hope to evoke in the thoughts of what you put? What do you want Hollis to understand from you writing your book?
So in the case of Malevolent 9, which, as I say, is the end of that trilogy, although you could pretty much just pick it up out of the blue if you wanted, I'm usually pretty careful to try to bring new readers into the story. A lot of it's about this notion of, do we have the right to stand in the way of paradise? What I mean by that is, most of us these days believe in democracy, right? But not everybody does. Some people think that actually, if we could have a really good king, or even hell, a dictator who came along and they're like, I'm going to fix everything, but no more of this, no more process, no more voting, whatever. Most of us, I think, would go, well, that's terrible. You can't do that. But what if it would look like it was working? What if it looked like everything was getting better? Do we still hold to that position? And part of the answer to that, in the case of this book, without spoiling anything for any of your audience, is really that when we talk about bringing about paradise, who's paradise and who's left out? I don't write polemics, so I don't write a book. This is a series that has a vampire dragon kangaroo in it, and the third book's greatest innovation is the addition of a flying koala sphinx. So, I'm not trying to make this a weighty philosophical treatise, but I do think that when you ask that question, what would paradise look like, and who would be left out of that paradise, it helps you think about all the people that we might not think about the rest of our day, right? Because my paradise might look very different from your paradise. What if even the paradise we found that you and I, we might find one that you and I were like, hey, that's great, we'll settle for that, right? Let's make the world more like that. but it forces you to think of, but who do we know who would be left out of that? And so, I think we've all had the experience as kids at some point or another of being the one who gets left out. And I think we forget about that when we become adults and we start to form our kind of groups, our almost tribal associations, politically or otherwise. And so I just really wanted to ask that question, both who has the right to stand in the way of, let's say, progress? You take something like AI today, right? And there'll be people saying, we shouldn't do this, don't build this data center, don't do this, But the people who make that stuff will say, well, we're trying to build this genius mind that can, eliminate diseases and this kind of stuff. Who has the right to stand in the way of that progress? And that part of how you have to answer that question is asking progress for who and who's left out of that progress.
Outstanding. Final comments, sir. How you believe these things that you just talked about, just mentioned, these lessons shape the future of the realm? How do you feel this is going to really shape what you do in the future with your trilogy, with your next projects and stuff like that?
The weird thing about writing the end to a series, and of course we live in an era where a lot of fantasy series don't seem like they get finished, right? Everybody's angry at George R.R. Martin for taking time, and Patrick Rothfuss and people like that. One of the weird things, though, is when you finish a series is that you realize you are closing the door, not on characters. You can always use them in a new series or create a follow-up series or something. But you are closing the door on a certain set of questions about the world that you, intentionally or otherwise, were exploring in that series. And that's one of the things I felt so profoundly when I finished the Greatcoats series, because it was all about idealism. And it's like, I will never be able to write about idealism the same way, because I had constructed this fantasy world and these characters, and somehow they all kept leading me towards those questions. And the same thing with Spellslinger, and now with Malevolent 7, realizing that this whole question of being an anti-hero or seeing yourself as an outsider from society, and yet being pulled in by a sense of just compassion for other human beings or duty or accident or whatever else, I won't get to really explore those questions in the same way again. And so it's bittersweet in that sense. It's wonderful in the sense of that feeling of completion. You feel like you've done something good and it's finished, right? Like it's not like part way done. So few things in life we ever get to feel like we've actually finished. Some people will buy a house and renovate it. They feel like they never really finished the renovations. But when you finish a trilogy, man, you have finished it, right? So that's wonderful, but at the same time, there's that sense of I can't go back to that particular well of subject matter, and so now I have to go somewhere new.
Sebastian, thank you so much for joining us. You're awesome. What a professional you are. You have a great rest of your week. Come on back anytime. We appreciate you. Your content you gave us was awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Hollis.
Have a great week, sir. We'll talk to you real soon.
Sounds
Bye-bye.
good. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.